Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just about to get started. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this joint event with alQaws for Gender and Sexual Diversity in Palestinian Society and the Adalah Justice Project. My name is Nasreen Elal. I was the 2020 Summer Fellow with alQaws, and today I have the great pleasure of moderating our event with two incredible activists. We have with us today Haneen Maikey, a Palestinian queer community organizer based in Jerusalem. Haneen is the co-founder and current director of alQaws. She also co-founded Palestinian Queers for BDS and has been involved in queer grassroots organizing for over 2 decades. Her writings have been featured in Adalah, Verso Books, and Counterpress. Haneen was also one of the main facilitators of the alQaws Fellowship Program, and working under her mentorship has tremendously broadened my knowledge and understanding of the Palestinian queer movement. Our second speaker today is Sumaya Awad, the Director of Strategy and Communications for AJP. Sumaya is a Palestinian writer and analyst based in New York City. Her writings focus on Palestinian liberation, anti-imperialism, Islamophobia, immigration, and have been featured in the Feminist Wire, In These Times, Open City, the Middle East Solidarity magazine, and Slate, among others. Her forthcoming edited volume, Palestine, A Socialist Introduction, will be released this December. I also had the privilege to share a campus with Sumaya at Columbia University and got to see her in action as a dedicated and principled student activist. To start us off today, I'll give a brief overview of the alQaws Fellowship and then talk a little bit about the new analysis paper that alQaws released this week, which is what will be anchoring today's discussion. Then we'll move into a moderated conversation for about 40 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A for the remaining time. We'll be using Zoom's Q&A feature to answer your questions, so please submit them there and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time we have left. You can also comment your questions in the Facebook comments on the Adalah or alQaws Facebook pages, and we'll try to collect as many as we can from there as well. I'd also like to give a shout out to Sandra and Izzy, who are helping us run today's events behind the scene. They'll also be dropping relevant links and resources in the chat throughout the event for those looking for further reading or resources. I'd also like to take a moment to thank all of our allied organizations and supporters who helped us to promote and share this week's event. So, this summer marked the second year of alQaws' fellowship program after the successful pilot of the program in 2019. This year's theme was Palestine through the lens of queer politics, and focused on cross-border networking, knowledge sharing, and movement building. It was initially conceived as a political education program based in Palestine, but due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we of course had to shift gears and do the fellowship remotely between Palestine and New York, among other locations. However, engagement and mentorship from alQaws activists remained crucial to the structure of the fellowship, and much of it focused on how to build out a network of organizers and supporters abroad who are interested in engaging a queer political movement that centers anti-colonial, feminist, and holistic approaches to combating oppression. One of the main tasks of the fellowship was the creation of a new anti-pinkwashing resource, which eventually became the analysis paper that was released this Monday. The document, titled Beyond Propaganda, Pinkwashing as Colonial Violence, explains a paradigm shift that queer Palestinian activists have been exploring and responding to over the past few years. For a long time, pinkwashing was understood primarily as a propaganda strategy. That is, how Israel presents itself to international audiences through state-backed marketing initiatives. Anti-pinkwashing activists therefore focused mainly on pointing out the hypocrisy of Israel advertising itself as a gay-friendly and progressive tourism destination, while also engaging in the violent oppression and colonization of Palestinian lives and land. However, in recent years, local queer Palestinian activists have realized that this is only one part of the story. Pinkwashing isn't just about propaganda used to cover up colonial violence. Pinkwashing is, in itself, a form of colonial violence. It doesn't simply affect how international audiences think about Palestine. It also affects Palestinians themselves, personally and psychologically, by pushing us to view our experiences and our communities through the lens of colonial prejudice, with devastating consequences. So one of the main goals for today's discussion will be explaining what colonial violence means in this context and exploring how we can develop a deeper understanding of Zionism's gendered and sexual politics and how activists have been responding to them. We'll also be discussing how this intervention from alQaws can inform anti-pinkwashing organizing going forward and how we can collectively build links between local activism and the transnational movement for Palestinian liberation. So that's the introduction. And now I'd like to hand the floor to Haneen and Sumaya to introduce their organizations, tell us a bit more about their work and the experiences that brought them to this event today.
Shall I go first? Okay. Hi everyone, and thank you for being here. It's really exciting to have this opportunity to, in a way, share half a year kind of internal discussions about things that's important to our heart and our lives. I want to just maybe briefly introduce alQaws. Hopefully that's not to take a lot of time. alQaws is a grassroots political organization, a queer feminist anti-colonial organization working in Palestine since 2001, right after the second Intifada, and more institutionalized, more strategic kind of approach since 2009-10. So basically we are closing a decade and a bit of we are organizing in Palestine. And when I say Palestine, I mean, I'm going to use historic Palestine, though I have a critique about it, but meaning we work in different areas that Palestinians living in 48, in 67 in East Jerusalem, not in Gaza, unfortunately, and we can discuss this also later. That's it. I think I've been involved in anti-pinkwashing and figuring out what is pinkwashing meaning for us as queer international and Palestinian activists for a decade now. And I think that's I'm really excited to share the lessons we learn through a lot of observation from our field experience in Palestine and enormous conversation with a lot of friends around the globe. So I'm really excited to have this discussion with you, Sumaya, and Nas.
Thanks, Haneen, and thanks, Naz, for the introduction. My name is Sumaya, and I'm here with the Adalah Justice Project. A little bit about Adalah. We're a Palestinian-led advocacy and activist organization based in the United States, but with very close, deep ties with various formations like alQaws in Palestine and across Palestine, Gaza, West Bank, and 48. And a lot of what we do sort of sets us apart from the rest of the movement in the US is that our lens, our primary approach to Palestinian liberation is through the perspective of collective liberation. And that's how we're here today and part of this conversation, and understanding how the different forms of oppression that tie our lives together under capitalism are all interlocked, whether they're race, gender, sexual orientation, class, etc. And that's what we're coming with here today, and excited to dive into this conversation.
Thank you both so much. My first question to start us off is for Haneen. So basically, can you tell us a bit about pinkwashing, what it is, what the current strategies and narratives are around this, Israeli strategy, and what their limitations are in terms of these narratives and strategies as an organizing framework?
Okay, so I think pinkwashing started to be more central in queer international and Palestinian conversation since a decade ago, if I'm not mistaken. And it's always centered Israeli propaganda that aims to promote Israel using LGBT. They're relatively good record of gay rights, and that's also a debatable kind of a question, or their queer friendliness to international audiences, basically making the Zionist project and the Israeli government more appealing to international audiences using their a queer and sexual and gender politics. And during that time, actually we in partnership, I think a lot of queer international activists and Palestinian activists, and through what I think, and that's not a critique, but just an observation, what it seems to be like kind of an organic kind of collective reaction to new kind of propaganda that we are meeting around us in different communities, and specifically in Palestine. And that like took off through a lot of like, in my opinion, with a lot of like noise. We made a lot of like, it was like really a vocal community. There was a lot of like international conferences, international campaigns, a lot of like campaigns that we canceled by the Israeli government. So it was a really kind of an intense kind of period where we, I think, use that like time to figure out what is pinkwashing, but mostly it focused on propaganda actions. It mostly focused on international queer activists, and it mostly focused on outside Palestine, right? So these like the three main, in a way, limitation that started to happen. And I think if I want to be more, in a way, organized, I'm not an organized speaker, so you need to forgive me. I'm gonna jump from point to point, but like, I think one of the main limitations of propaganda perspective of pinkwashing is that what I just said, that focused all of the activism and the attention on the outside, right? And the second main thing is that is focused on like the type of activism, right? So we focus more on canceling propaganda events, right? Asking allies to withdraw a film or sign a petition or cancel an event, or not being complicit or not attend speaking engagement in a campus somewhere in the US that hosting Israeli LGBT soldier, and all of these like aspects. And in a way, it like neglected the educational part, right? Or the movement building part, or the alliances kind of a priority that it needs to sustain such an interesting movement. Of course, like, we are not, we don't need to forget that also, like, in a way, pinkwashing and anti-pink, the beginning of anti-pinkwashing activism was the opportunity or the main window in which a lot of queer international activists engaged with Palestine, right? Doesn't mean that we knew what is Palestine and what is our, like, as an international queer activist, what is our opinion, how much attitudes and like misconceptions we have, what kind of our position to the different layers of the Zionist project and its impact to Palestine. And that was really, really important, because like, in a way, we skipped discussing Palestine, right, and jumped into, in a way, combating kind of specific events by the Israeli government, and mostly propaganda events. So I think a lot of course, a lot of movements do that while like working, and that's like a natural to any movement building. But I think we didn't have a lot of like time and space, and I think because of it was a transnational kind of a movement, it was even harder to do so. One last thing in this, like answering your question, Nas, like, I think one other limitation by centering queer international activists and putting them on the spot, also when leading campaigns and when they are attacked by Zionist trolls, right? And in a way, it limited the conversation in specific movement and in specific groups. And somehow we didn't engage, or rarely engaged, any Arab or Muslim or non-white communities in North America and Europe, right? Queers or non-queers. Most of the anti-pinkwashing actions remained like limited to special groups that were created to address pinkwashing. Even like, you know, a lot of different groups in different cities, their like specialty was to combat kind of pinkwashing events. And while it's like organizing wise, that's really smart, because and alQaws did it too, right? And into the creation of Palestinian Queers for BDS, in a way, it created some kind of a false at least for Palestine, and a full split between anti-pinkwashing and fighting patriarchy and LGBT issues in Palestine, right? And in North America and Europe, it created this illusion that we could fight pinkwashing outside our movements, right? Instead of integrating these analyses and this lens into what we are doing right now, right? Whether it's anti-racist work in the US or like queer radical groups in different places, or the Palestinian queer movement. And I think like, in a way, focusing on these aspects and neglecting these other aspects shifted in a way the anti-pinkwashing organizing and strategies and narratives away from Palestine, away from the settler-colonial context of Palestine, and definitely away from the important questions of how pinkwashing and anti-pinkwashing activism is impacting the lives and realities of Palestinian queers.
Yeah, and I think now I'd like to dive a bit deeper into sort of the implications of this shift. So you've sort of taken us through the shift from, you know, propaganda to colonial violence, and the sort of shift it mirrors in terms of centering pinkwashing in terms of how it's experienced by primarily Western international audiences, to centering how it's experienced locally by Palestinian activists and their communities. So could you talk a little bit more about how pinkwashing operates in this context, what kind of narratives it pushes, and how that contributes to the sort of fragmentation and violence within communities?
Yes. First of all, like I have to say that with the decline of like a lot of transnational anti-pinkwashing activism, because of a lot of limitation, that this is not the time or like the place to dive deeper into. In a way, the shift started by, in a way, forcing alQaws and a lot of queer Palestinian activists asking how it's impacting us, right? So the first shift was our priority to look inside, which we did, to be honest, from a lot of disappointments from international solidarity groups, from a lot of disappointments from regional activism that, in our opinion, like took the wrong political kind of path, right? And this way, alQaws more and more like focused locally. And because we are work on a national level and not like on a only local level, that demanded a lot of resources in alQaws. So that shift in a way was also like a reactionary and organic, and at the same time, we started to meet a lot of like tens and hundreds of queer people who's like talking from first experience about how pinkwashing is impacting their life, right? And that was like mind-blowing to us, because like though we are living here and we are engaged in queer organizing in a daily level, in a way organically integrating the question of the impact of colonialism and pinkwashing on our life somehow was in English, somehow it was like the outside, somehow it was not relevant here. And I think that's the main thing. And we have been having this conversation locally and internally in alQaws since 2014. This was the first time we started to discuss how pinkwashing is not propaganda, how framing it as a propaganda really limiting not only the activism, but its impact, and really in a way harming our movement. And that gave us a lot of like confidence in trying and starting to talk about these in Arabic too. So we published like a lot of articles about this. Someone in social media questioned us why we publish this in English only, and we just answered that we have been publishing it in Arabic since 2015, right? So like 5 years after, we are here, and I think I don't want to, for the sake of not repeating the document and the amazing insights and points that were made there, I want to maybe just give you some insight on the 3 levels I think we could also look about this colonial violence, and how holistic it is, right? Because like the document gives you in a way the wrong message that is only impacting queer Palestinians, right? But the point of this document is that it's impacting Palestine and Palestinians and Palestinian queers and the Palestinian queer movement. And maybe quickly, Nas, if I have the time to just talk about each level briefly, so we can be on the same page of in the same language and same page. So the first one is queer Palestinians, that the document do well in really explaining how also politically and psychologically impacting queer Palestinians, but mainly it's targeting specific queer Palestinians, right? Queer Palestinians who already in a way suffer from some social or familial violence because of their sexuality, or youth who lack access to social or economic opportunities which allow them to negotiate somehow their sexuality safely enough in Palestine. So these groups that more their main lens of their sexuality is this crucial pain in interacting with society and family. And also it's easy to internalize pinkwashing narrative and myths, right? And in other words, pinkwashing thrives on capitalizing on our pain, right? If there is no pain, if there is no Palestinian society homophobia, if there are queer Palestinians who have no pain with their sexuality, there is no pinkwashing. And the only and they're not only framing or abusing our pain or framing our reality, but it's in a way controlling or killing any hopes or vision for better future, right? So there is no possibilities of living in Palestine. There is no way that any queer people could live safely in this place. So in this story of pinkwashing, queer Palestinians are ever the victim, never ever of the occupation or colonialism. But always victims of their families, their societies, and believe it or not, victims of the queer Palestinian movement, according to some pinkwashing activists. And in this story also, the colonizers, Israelis, in this case, a lot of LGBT Israeli activists, appears in the role of the savior. And in most of the cases and most of the time, it's promoted as the only savior, right? So it's not like an option thing. It's the only way for you to be saved. The second level is the violence on Palestinian society, right? And alQaws work a lot, have a lot of strategic vision in how we talk with our society and how we approach sexual and gender diversity, and how tactically we engage different groups in Palestinian society in the conversation about different issues, by the way, including pinkwashing, right? But pinkwashing in a way portray our struggle and our pain as associated with Israelis and with Israel, right? And that mean we are collaborators, or we are Israelized, or we are more want to have this kind of a lifestyle, right? So this is really reinforce the myth that Palestinian queers are foreign, unnatural, outsider of this culture, of the society. And this is the proof. See, queer and most of my training, that when I train a lot of Palestinian groups, we have this question. But you go to Tel Aviv, right? You always hate your society, right? You always you are westernized, but you just speak Arabic, right? So all of these myths that we know they exist, are really reinforced by pinkwashing, and it's further alienate queer Palestinians as a specific and outsider group. So in this narrative, the binary of the civilized colonizer and the backward native not only supports in a way conservative homophobic violence discourse in Palestine, but it also brings some kind of a global dynamic, right? Because it started to measure Palestine according to the queer lens, right? Are you friendly? You're not friendly? How many people you, and we have been asked all the time by human rights organization and different how many people you are killed in Palestine, all of these questions that will never ask you how much achievement arguments you had with therapists, with teachers, with queer youth, right? It's only about like how much, what is the number and not even the reality, right, of violent incidents. I want to like maybe finish with answering this question by saying something about the impact on the Palestinian queer movement. And in my opinion, perhaps it's the least discussed point because we were always like there in the anti-pinkwashing activism, and we are powerful and we are like confident and we are like political and we are radical. So it doesn't like really click to a lot of people. But in the narrative of pinkwashing, we don't exist because like pinkwashing is based on the idea that there is no possibility of change in Palestine, right? And I think the queer Palestinian movement, specifically in this case, is the only, right? Like this is the group that's making the change, right? So ignoring us or saying things like, and this is, you can see in Hebrew media a lot, that the Palestinian queer movement have no capacity to or the needed resources to fight patriarchy and homophobia in Palestine, or even worse, that the Palestinian queer movement priority is wrong, right? They're focusing on fighting us, the savior of the Palestinian queers, instead of investing in changing your society. And unfortunately, these myths do not stop among pinkwashing activists, but also reproduced in different circles. So we hear them from a lot of like anti-pinkwashing activists. We hear them a lot from queer Palestinian activists who started to use this like pinkwashing kind of a narrative to say, oh, you're talking about colonialism more, you should focus on fighting homophobia. Social issues are more important. So the split is recreated again and again in different circles. And this is really, really interesting because the Palestinian queer movement, and I don't want to be humble here, but it's just one of few thriving, sustainable political projects in Palestine, right? And despite that, and this is the project that is proving the opposite of what pinkwashing is saying, right? There are queer Palestinians who are visible, who's like a social change agent, who like changing their own reality and society. And there is the Palestinian society who's just not one thing. We have supporters, we have allies, we have our homophobes, we have our right-wing and conservative discussions. So I think the real, like ignoring the queer Palestinian movement is one of the most like violent, in my opinion, against like hundreds and thousands of like queer activists in Palestine.
Thank you, Haneen, so much for that in-depth sort of breakdown of pinkwashing. Now I want to turn to Sumaya and ask, sort of from the perspective of the Palestinian movement in the North American and diaspora context, you know, what are the stakes of this intervention? AJP is like invested in, you know, sort of making a very concerted effort to form these links with local formations in Palestine. And I think that in part combats the erasure that Haneen was talking about, because it ensures that even when, you know, on the top level in media or in coverage, you know, even if the queer movement isn't addressed, there are still these trans-local connections that are being made, which I think are very important. But I wanted to ask you, you know, sort of what your experience of reading the document was and like engaging with pinkwashing through this framework, and how you think it could broaden or reorient our approach to pushing Palestinian liberation more generally.
Thanks, Naz. And thank you, Haneen, for all of that. I mean, I think this document should become something that is read across the Palestine movement in the US in all of its levels, from sort of the grassroots and campus spaces to the NGOs and the more like advocacy spheres on the top. First, I think the intervention is extremely important because of a lot of what Haneen explained, which is just that in the US, a lot of the approach to pinkwashing is focused on brand Israel, and as a result, doesn't really talk about Palestinian queers and what exists on the ground and groups like alQaws, et cetera. And I won't repeat everything Haneen said, but I think that's one of the biggest interventions that is making and has a large audience here in the US. But I think more than that, it forces us to remodel the approach we take to gender and sexual liberation within the Palestine movement, and to move away from this approach that we've taken that's like single issue politics, the single issues framework that I think exists in all movements, not just the Palestine movements. And I'll get into it later about why. But what that means is, this idea of like, okay, we can talk about gender liberation and sexual liberation, like in this event or in this context, and then separate from that, let's talk about settler colonialism. Like, what's our main goal, settler colonialism? Then comes X, Y, and Z, as opposed to, no, our framework needs to be an intersectional sort of interlocutor framework to begin with that understands that liberation from settler colonialism is part of liberation, queer and gender liberation, women's liberation, etc. And this is building off of a very long history, I think, of radical queer politics that exists internationally, and that Haneen alluded to in what they said. And I think, in other words, what I'm trying to say is it provides us with an understanding that race, gender, sexuality, and class all intersect, right? And that lays the basis of our current conditions. And by extension, that means our response needs to be a response that is able to contend with and combat these different forms of oppression in ways that are organic, that build organic connections into our liberation struggle. And without an analysis, such as the one that this document lays bare, our movement as a whole is weakened because it means it's lacking this liberatory framework that speaks to a very particular part of our community, and by extension allows colonial powers, and in this case it's Israel, but it's also appeared in many other settler colonial states, but allows Israel in this case to exploit relations within the Palestinian community and between queers and non-queers. And I think that's exactly what this document lays bare and makes very clear. And so it's a really stark and important reminder with grave consequences that our goal isn't to simply replace our colonizers, right? That our goal is so much more than that. It's to sort of have a vision and create new norms within our own society and within what we want to build for that thrives on collectivity, not on exclusivity or a hierarchy in terms of like a ladder of the different oppressions we need to fight leading up to something. And that necessitates that we don't reproduce the structures of oppression that we're purporting to fight in our daily struggles. And I think one like just very like direct way of putting it is it's not about sort of ticking off the boxes. Did we discuss gender and queer liberation? Yes, great. Did we talk about racism? Yes. Did we talk about that doesn't actually contend with the organic connections that exist. And oftentimes I think in our movements, we don't really give credit to the intuitive and organic ways that most people under capitalism are able to make these connections quite easily. And we assume that they're not, and that everything has to be like palatable, and accessible. And as a result, we dilute and really water down our messages and our radicalism and miss very, very important and critical building blocks in forming any sort of sustainable movement. Let's see. Yeah, so I mean, I think one way of just directly putting it is that a queer feminist analysis isn't linked to the broader vision for liberation, but it's actually the foundation for one, because it challenges and disrupts the existing norms of society under capitalism, which thrive on individualism, on the nuclear family unit, on social reproduction for like the sake of keeping certain power balances in check. And a queer feminist analysis, like the one this document puts out, disrupts that. I mean, it completely ruptures that. And that's exactly what we need to build the kind of movement we want for full liberation, not for a liberation that reproduces the society that we have today. And when I was reading this, now as you asked what some of my first reactions are when I was reading this, one of the first things that came to mind was the Combahee River Collective. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Combahee River Collective, it's a Black, radical, queer, feminist, socialist organization. And they released this statement in 1977 that was an intervention on the Black liberation struggle. And there's this one quote from there that I want to read because I think it really gets at what we're talking about here. The quote reads, We are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that major systems of oppression are interlocking. The synthesis of these oppressions creates the conditions of our lives." End quote. I think that alongside the alQaws statement just underscores and pins that our goal is to build as large and powerful a liberation movement as possible. But, and that but is crucial, that shouldn't come at the expense of diluting our politics or our demands for the sake of just having as many people as possible. And that gender and sexual liberation are often sidelined in that pursuit and sort of considered an afterthought. And in fact, that can't be the case. Just like racism and Islamophobia are not something we can confront like only after we've ended settler colonialism, but that they're actually part of that confrontation, and that the two are very inherently intertwined, and that there is no liberation from oppression unless it's from all forms of oppression. I think this has been made very, very clear with the Black Lives Matter movement here in the US. And if we can adopt a lot of the lessons we've learned to these other spheres of oppression, I think we can go a long way in like hardening and building our movement. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sumaya. That was really helpful. Bringing us sort of to the Palestine movement and the stakes for it, and sort of bringing us out to look at like the larger picture and the sort of implications it has, for basically any, struggle for justice, and the stakes of sort of having a holistic intersecting analysis, to our vision for the future. So now I think I want to move us a bit to talk about how, that sort of has played out in the specific historical context of Palestine in recent decades. Because as Haneen mentioned, a lot of activism around pinkwashing took off, in the post-Second Intifada, like early 2000s, and especially after the Israeli government launched Brand Israel in 2005. And Brand Israel being this part of this effort to improve Israel's image internationally through the sort of use and spread of political propaganda that sought to literally rebrand Israel, which had this association with war and militarism, as a progressive, gay-friendly, eco-friendly, vegan, racially diverse, anything you can name, sort of state in order to combat the rise of the Palestine solidarity movement. And at the same time, this period, coming off the heels of the Oslo Accords, was also a period where we were witnessing, this increasing fragmentation and demobilization of Palestinian political power. So Sumaya, I wonder if you can sort of take us a bit into how this kind of broader perspective, so going, taking more maybe the long and broad historical view, can help us, understand how this led to the context that like activists are working in today in terms of, having to deal with this colonial fragmentation and erasure and like structures of exclusion.
Thanks, Naz. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say from the outset that this is many, many books. So I'll do my best to try to really summarize, I think, some of the important things that pertain to our conversation today. Like Naz said, after the Second Intifada, there was a very important shift that was in many ways rooted in the Oslo era in the 90s. But this shift marked a move away from civil society, from popular movements and grassroots movements and organizing, to what is often referred to as good governance. In other words, governing bodies that are ruled usually by elements of the upper class and who serve to sort of maintain a peace and recycle like hollow mantras of human rights, right? And stability. I think those are their two favorite words, human rights and stability. And Israel, of course, during this period, talking about like 2005-ish, used this to do what they called separation and control. And so they fragmented physically Palestine as a whole, even more so than it was. And simultaneously, as this fragmentation was taking place, you had very large donors and organizations, some in the form of governments and like government aid and projects, and others as private institutions, come in and begin a sort of neoliberal peace building project. And of course, during this, it was sections of the bureaucratic institutions that came about during Oslo that benefited from a lot of this aid and these peace packages. And they built they built a sort of like thriving, albeit still under, Israeli settler colonialism, private sector that came with a lot of coordination with Israel, specifically around security, and very quickly produced a layer of people whose interest was inherently tied to preserving this type of status quo at the expense, of course, of Palestinian freedom more generally. And all of this is sort of important to have as context for how Palestinian society was fragmented, physically using checkpoints, militarized borders, IDs, etc., but then socially and politically as well. This fragmentation altered the way Palestinian liberation movement had previously experienced collectivity as sort of like the path towards liberation. And so it changed the way the Palestinian liberation movement, how it related to itself, and then as a result, how it related to the colonizer, Israel. So I think this type of the social and political fragmentation in particular is very important because that's what allowed for certain sections of Palestinian society to be seen as like outside the norm or not Palestinian enough, but still under the colonization and the brutality of Israeli settler colonialism, while not participating in like Palestinian civil society, which had sort of been overturned by the NGOs. And many of the reverberations of this period, this isolation fragmentation, I think can be mapped out on the US context today quite easily. So one big example of this, and I mentioned this earlier, is this idea of single issue approaches to organizing and advocacy. And that is so inherently tied to NGOs, right? With the like, you apply for a project, you have a very specific short-term vision of like XYZ, human rights, stability. That's about not disrupting the way things are laid out, not causing too much damage, and often under the guise of, we don't want to further fragment Palestinians, whereas it is essentially doing that fragmentation in and of itself. And I think that that framework of let's do this, then that also falls well with what I mentioned earlier about like, let's just focus on settler colonialism and not talk about these other issues of oppression. Gender and sexual oppression, I think, being the top of the list, although there are other examples, and becomes very top down and rooted in an accountability model that is geared upwards. So like, what do the donors want? What do the NGOs expect? As opposed to having deep ties in the civil society and then in the people experiencing the impact of settler colonialism on the ground in Palestine. And then within that, the most vulnerable communities that are sidelined or silenced. I think a very important part of this that Haneen also mentioned is that this framework really allows the victim mentality to thrive and allows for our struggle to be depoliticized, completely depoliticized. And with the constant threat of, we don't want to lose stability. And so I think one thing this document does, or sort of urges us to contend with and think about, is to look internally into our structures of organizing and the norms that we are reproducing that reinforce some of these oppressions, and to think about what it means to disrupt stability and to disrupt these depoliticizing arguments today, in a way that allows us to think of our fight against settler colonialism as an integrated fight, right? And I think this call this document is a call in that direction. That's my short take.
Thank you. Yeah, I know it's a lot of ground to cover, but I think you covered it very well. And now so that we have this kind of context of how things have shifted in the past few decades, I'd like to turn again to Haneen and ask about how this process of fragmentation and demobilization has been experienced not only by queer Palestinians and by the queer Palestinian movement, but within Palestinian society more generally. Because we see, I think, especially in the past few years, since 2015, pinkwashing, like other facets of the colonial state, has evolved dramatically in recent years, whether that's in terms of checkpoints getting upgrades. So now they just look like, sleek airports, that people slide through with their biometric ID cards, even though the same surveillance and like repressive state is in place, or the installation of a native class of Palestinians who are basically tasked with subcontracting and doing the dirty work of the occupation instead of, the occupiers doing it directly. So I want to turn this question to ask about pinkwashing in that context. And if Haneen, you could talk about the more sophisticated and maybe harder to identify forms that pinkwashing now takes and how alQaws has responded to them.
Thank you, Nas, and thank you, Sumaya. Maybe I will just like briefly engage with what Sumaya was saying about like, I always say when I like finish my position in alQaws, I will write a book about the violence of international organizations and foundations and international NGOs and human rights organization using the queer question and the queer movement. And I think you are really accurate using the threat of depoliticizing our movement. And I think it was really interesting to see 2 years ago, basically it's a year ago, just like 14 months ago, when the Palestinian Authority issued a statement banning alQaws activities in the West Bank. They have no legal ground to do that, and also asking Palestinian average citizen to participate in this persecution by reporting any suspicious queer communities. And we could see the reaction. We as queers and Palestinian who living in this like place, we understand that PA is a violent kind of entity. We don't support, we don't legitimize the Palestinian Authority. And it was really interesting, the opportunities that started to be used by international community, right? So it's now an opportunity to fix the relationship between alQaws and the Palestinian Authority, right? Maybe we can ask them for protection. Maybe alQaws will not be that politicized now against Israel and pinkwashing, because now they have their own government attacking them, right? So that really like inserted a lot of like really weird dynamic. And I remember like one representative for a big international organization announcing in pure enjoyment that she spoke to someone from the PA and maybe they could fund shelters for LGBT youth in Palestinian in the West Bank, which is like, for me, was like really mind blowing, because like we have been around for 20 years saying with whom, what is our relationship to our oppressor and who's our oppressor, and what is the problem that we are like trying to target here. And suddenly when, you know, things are mixed up between social state violence and what is state, right? And who's, and in this like really weird map in Palestine, who's legitimizing the PA and who's not. And like, so alQaws is really rare in like taking a position against like any, the PA and the Israeli government. I see them contributing to the sustainability of colonialism in Palestine. So that's like a really an interesting point to see how the neoliberal context of the West Bank specifically are really contributing to the violence against the Palestinian queers and alQaws specifically. And we could see international foundations and organizations like stopping supporting alQaws because they fear from persecution from the PA. It was like, we are the persecuted one, right? So you could see a really weird kind of dynamic, but I think it's really worth to look into and explore further and really learn from. But like answering your question quickly, yeah, we talked about this, Nas, like, and briefly in our preparation meeting. What I'm gonna like maybe share is just like my observation from the last 2 years of being really involved in managing and working with individuals who need some kind of seek some kind of an Israeli organization help, already entered Israel illegally and have some kind of interaction with LGBT organizations, or already in a process of securing a permit to legally stay in Israel. And it was really, for me, interesting to see maybe perhaps three new developments, because not only the queer Palestinian movement getting more into sophisticated strategies and like narratives, but also our enemy is like planning and developing their strategy and really reading, kind of capitalizing on the context. And one really interesting point is pinkwashing is not only, is not passive. Like actually Israeli LGBT organization from the beginning, but newly now more strategically, they have actually active outreach programs, right? So it's not that you are like, if you're hating your family and want to look where to just like travel and like run away from them, the first one to catch your attention is Israeli LGBT organization, who's like on their messenger and in their inboxes trying to answer all of your concerns, how to get to Israel, how to approach them. There's a whole plan of like who's gonna like welcome them as if like someone is just like really normally traveling from Palestine to Israel. And it's really interesting to see how it just like normalized, right? It's just like as a border crossing almost, as not a colonized, like full of checkpoints and place. And that's the opposite of the reality, because actually no one is welcoming you, right? So after you made this like exhausting journey to get to Tel Aviv, and as we know, there is no pink doors in the apartheid wall, so it's a really hard and harsh and inhuman kind of a journey to get to Tel Aviv. So reality hits you in the face. Bureaucracy, the bureaucracy and laws, the Israeli laws actually prevents you from being there. Yeah, you could have like as many LGBT Israeli activists that could tell you that is like going to be possible, but the entry and citizenship law prevents Palestinians from being inside Israel legally, right? Horrifying realities and about like accommodation, about working, about earning money, right? All of these are like suddenly erased from your like possibilities, right? And we see more after like one night in Tel Aviv that usually people meet you and give you 100 shekel, which is $20 for a one-night hostel, and they disappear into like managing your bureaucracy or like papers in front of the Israeli authority, but that's it, right? You are left without any future possibilities. You left to homelessness, to social isolation, to constant fear from authorities. I just like had two friends who now with the pandemic and the lockdown, the threat is even doubled, right? Because like they are not only illegal, they are illegal because they're outside in a public space, right? I had this like friend who ran away and broke their like arms and legs, right? And now have like health care too, which is also not accessible. So it's really like kind of an intense kind of a social and economical kind of problems that for Israeli LGBT groups who are doing the outreach is nothing, right? It's just, and one really interesting thing in the last year, shelters, LGBT shelters in Tel Aviv, who used to be the place who welcome LGBT queer youth from the West Bank, have a clear formal government restrictions not to host Palestinian queers from the West Bank, right? So even that myth that like at least shelters who have social workers who are like not LGBT activists by default have more professional accountability, have a formal like restriction, or they cannot actually host any West Bank queers. That's like one new thing that I noticed. The second thing, and I think it's really risky, and I think I want to say something, and it's not, maybe it's not accurate because I'm trying to figure this out, but I think there is a special attempt or a process led by a lot of queer Israelis who's like human rights defenders or lawyers, people who believe in the queer kind of identity and oppression as a main lens identity, and in a way, they started to develop some kind of legal procedures that can allow Palestinian queers to stay in Israel, right? So just to be clear, these like legal procedures are not permanent, right? And not established in any law. And there is no guarantee to be renewed, but there is a special effort that's been done, right? And that's not naive, right? It was, I think they were able to do that, and I saw it from like really working with tens of cases in the last year. They are able to do that because they are able to advocate for queer oppression as an exceptional one in front of the intelligence forces, the Israeli intelligence forces. And they were able to do that because they are linked to the intelligence forces, the Israeli intelligence forces, because Israelis and LGBT activists specifically are linked to IDF, the government, and intelligence forces. So this kind of access and this kind of alliances and this kind of partnership that benefits Palestinian queers, I would really question it hard and not and really be careful about this development. You know, they do the interview and take your story and testimony, which is like queer to queer, it's safe, right? But this information is delivered by Israeli LGBT activists to the intelligence forces that they take the decision. It's not a civil procedure, right? And that's really, really important to remember. Maybe the two last points is recently with the growing visibility of violence, social violence in Palestine against LGBT people, and with the development of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, joining the party, right? And a lot of like cases that we saw the violence, the physical violence, right? That was a big opportunity for a lot of LGBT Israeli groups to capitalize on it. They made a lot of money. They are announcing they're opening services for LGBT queer and queer youth Palestinians, also from the West Bank and also living in 48, right? And each almost like we are now doing some kind of work around it. Each LGBT organization in Israel and each community, LGBT community center, have a specific program or a service for LGBT Palestinians, right? And now when speaking with a lot of people around this, like, and I think the pandemic triggered this a lot. We could see how many people report racism, patronizing, right? Questioning their story. In a way, they want to prove to their, like, not only to the intelligence forces the story is true, but also to their funder, right? So there is a whole kind of a new code now of like who is the good asylum seeker, Palestinian asylum seeker, right? And they have a new kind of a code of, which is a violent code again, against queer Palestinian bodies. And maybe the last point, and I think it's a heartbreaking development for me, it's actually there is now a lot of Palestinian queers leading pinkwashing initiatives and running a lot of these programs inside LGBT Israeli organizations, right? And in a way that's like, yes, Palestinian queers are also like any other group. They have the liberal and the radical, and our relation to our oppressor like changes, depends of who we are and our experience. And that's not exceptional to Palestinian queers, right? And how we participate in the political kind of question of Palestine. But I think this putting Palestinians in the front and not giving them any actually power, right? Because they are not running the programs, they are like the faces of these organizations, in a way further legitimize pinkwashing and actually operates more violence on queer Palestinians. And I want to stop here hear Sumaya and maybe get to Q&A soon. Thank you, Nas.
Yeah, Sumaya, if you have any sort of points that you want to like follow up with on that, otherwise I think I just have like a concluding comment and then we can move to Q&A.
I have a lot to say, but for the sake of time, I will integrate it into my answers into the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, I think the only thing I want to draw out, I think from both of your last two answers was this this thread of where the power is and how, you know, the power dynamics, particularly within the colonial situation, affect a lot of like how this work is done. So it has to do with, you know, what the state is doing and what the state is funding, but also the role of these sort of international funders, donors, NGOs, international human rights organizations. And I think the particular threat that they pose specifically in terms of out resourcing and out funding local and grassroots initiatives, in terms of capacity, in terms of the amount of like hotlines and shelters that they're able to set up, you know, that have these particular restrictive politics and policies, but also are like competing with, you know, the organic and local and like community-based grassroots advocacy. So I think to me, those last two answers really made that clear in a very stark way. And I think now we'll move to the Q&A. There's one question I saw that I'd like to open with. Okay, so this question goes, part of the Zionist narrative is that Palestinian queers who run away from their society because of homophobic threats find a safe haven in Israeli society, with Tel Aviv being the Mecca, the gay Mecca of this narrative. And moreover, that the Israeli state gives protection to those Palestinian queers as the sort of refugees against the harms of their families and communities. How do you reply to this false narrative, and what is the reality on the ground? So I think a lot of the points by Haneen and Sumaya kind of covered a couple of these points, but I think maybe one thing that you could both maybe give a comment on is the sort of relationship between narrative and reality, and sort of the big task of pinkwashing is, you know, is that it promotes like a very convincing, because it's a very simplistic narrative, and particularly in terms of how these issues are like covered in the media, and this narrative about gay Tel Aviv, homophobic Palestinians has such currency in media coverage. So maybe you can talk a bit about that, and then how to identify these kinds of tropes and, you know, combat them.
Me, Sumaya.
Maybe Haneen, you can start maybe with the Tahini company controversy and what that sort of showed.
Yes, I think we addressed a lot of this, like of this question in my previous like presentation, but I think like and this is, you know, we are talking about the new development now of pinkwashing, and we are analyzing it, but hundreds of queer Palestinians living in Tel Aviv, that's early 2000 narrative, and that's if we are talking about Oslo, right? that started right after Oslo, when a lot of like queer Palestinians just moved to big cities, right? And these big cities for work or for like lifestyle or whatever, right? So this kind of a couple of years that things were open and people could just like maybe relatively easily move, at least for work purposes. That was like the beginning of that narrative, right? And it became now a big thing, right? There is now a system of Israeli organizations and human rights organizations like Hayas or Aguda, right? Operating programs to make, to give people like a refugee status in Israel, right? And really interesting, I think how much percentage of that they are like can they actually win. I don't think it's more than 1%, and it's not permanent. But also, like, if we, because you're talking about myth and narrative, Nas, right? And how just this myth is like ridiculous. Like, Israel is a refugee-making machine for at least 100 years. So how suddenly this like this Zionist entity who made, I don't know, thousands and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians refugee for either forever or for time and time, right? Could be the same place, the same entity who gives refugee status. And I think this contradiction is just what should lead us. Yes, there are like some individual cases. Maybe someone fell in love with an Israeli guy and they made it happen with a lawyer, or like someone who had a specific social context and they gave them permanent, or here and there people live illegally but somehow found their like community. These are not like policies. These are cases. These are like some few stories from a lot of unfortunate stories, right? And also, this is not exceptional for Palestinian queers. Also, families in Palestine cannot be united because of the same laws, right? So this is like really interesting to understand also the myth and the narrative, and really separate it from facts and from laws, and khalas, the Palestine being colonized and the Israeli war crimes is the most documented thing on earth, right? I don't think we need to continue repeating these things, and I think we need to move forward. But I already forgot your other questions, Nas, but maybe you can jump to Sumaya, and I can follow up on that later.
Yeah, I'll be brief. There's so many great questions coming in. I think what you just ended on, Haneen, about how like we don't need to keep going over what Israel is such an intuitive and yet sort of difficult thing for people to contend with, because like we're in the 21st century and there's a settler-colonial state. And I think a lot of the reasons why people use so many of the tropes that Naz you referenced and Haneen you laid out earlier about like the modern versus barbaric, the sort of like innately backward Palestinians cloaked in all this Islamophobia, both internally within Palestinian society, like when you talk about Palestinians in Gaza or in certain places in the West Bank or 48, et cetera, versus like Palestinians in Ramallah or whatever. All of that, the reason there has to be this, these tropes and stereotypes is to justify why something like this is happening in the 21st century. Like this idea of colonized and colonizer, I think is so hard for people to grapple with. And so they assume all of these other justifications for the violence that's taking place and that's unfolding. And I think one thing this document makes very clear, and I don't want to repeat the document, but is how all of these are used to push pinkwashing to be only seen as like the propaganda part and not as like the actual lived experience of Palestinians. And then by extension, how the community as a whole needs to respond to this and integrate it into our analysis, into our decolonial movement. Anyway, I'll stop there because I'm seeing there's some other questions and we're running low on time.
Yes. Just on that note, I just kind of wanted to draw out the sort of unexceptional nature of the sort of narrative of pinkwashing in terms of the inversion that it's doing, of like switching the role of the colonized and colonizer, you know, and sort of reversing the sort of who was victimized and who was the aggressor dynamic. And this being something that I feel like was encountered very consistently in campus organizing in terms of, you know, framing Palestinians as the terrorists, as the anti-Semites, as, you know, homophobic. So it being, you know, not at all restricted to issues of gender and sexuality, but I think it's part of an overarching attempt to do just what you sort of laid out, Sumaya, which is kind of like invert the dynamic, because otherwise, you know, it's so straightforward. And this question, I think, Sumaya, if you want to lead with it, it's two sort of similar questions. One, which is, can you talk about how anti-pinkwashing work outside of Palestine can or should operate with this reorientation, especially since it's mostly done by collectives rather than NGOs? And then the follow-up being, what might this document mean concretely for the ways in which international activists could not only adjust their analytical frame, but also their organizing strategies?
Yeah, I can start with that. So I think one of the most basic things that this calls for is a shift away from the focus on propaganda, and thinking about how to center Palestinian queers and Palestinian queer organizing on the ground. And by this I don't mean, and Haneen, you should speak more to this, but it doesn't mean like, how do we just ask a Palestinian queer to talk about X, Y, or Z, right? This is an issue that affects all of us, not just Palestinian queers, in terms of how do we get free? How do we build for liberation? And I think what that means, and what this document's calling for, is integrate this analysis, integrate these points into how we approach all of our organizing, not just our organizing around sexual and gender liberation, but how do we integrate it into everything we're doing around collective liberation and Palestinian liberation in particular. And what this means is difficult, actually. It is very intuitive, but it's also difficult because of the way that our movement is structured. And so it sort of is a challenge to contend with how do we decolonize the spaces that we're in, and begin to approach our work on the ground through this new lens. And there isn't a straightforward answer in terms of first do this, then do that, then do this. I think that's actually the problem that sort of got us to where we are right now, is this idea of boxes to check off. And I think it's just the beginning of what needs to be a much longer, more in-depth internal look at the structures of our movement, and the single issue fragmentation that we have reproduced internally, and to sort of approach it through there. And I realize that is not the most reassuring of answers, because it's not an easy, this is what I'm going to do tomorrow. But I think that's the struggle of building a sustainable movement that is bottom up and that is sustainable, and that takes us, for the long haul, and not for this is what we get at the end of this year or that year. And I think, like, to me, that's what this document did. That's the kind of wake up call it was for what we need to do going forward. Haneen, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, maybe I will pick up with the first question of about how the anti-pinkwashing activism declined, and the challenge with in conversation with Palestinian queers. And I think it's really an amazing question, because it's so concrete and maybe explains what that means, also centering Palestinian queer voices. I don't want to stamp every statement or every action. I don't want to call every filmmaker to withdraw the Zionist LGBT Film Festival. That's not my role, and this is not what we mean by, and I think this is the dynamic that was happened, that a lot of the international solidarity and anti-pinkwashing activism was in a way relying on Palestinian queers, and in a way trying to reproduce Palestinian queers as some kind of a representative, or the stars of, or like, and I personally, I was part of this dynamic, right? I remember two queer Palestinians telling me, but hey, Haneen, but our values are not like, we are a collective, we are not like into these like stars thing and individual and PQBDS, and we are like more a collective, and that like hit me really hard, because we were also engaging, and I think Maya asked this question, this dynamic in a way drained Palestinian queers, because I think we were used. There was not like a partnership, there was not collaboration, in my opinion, there was not discussion about what we are gonna do, or what is the priorities, or how we understand pinkwashing, or how we keep understanding pinkwashing, because everything is changing around us. And I don't, not to be understood wrong, I don't blame anyone, right? I think it's just like a lot of reasons and context brought us, and a lot of bad interventions from a lot of like academics and organizers. It's okay, like movements go through a lot of like mistakes and tough periods. But I think what I'm trying to say is that also the relationship with Palestinian queers, and what kind of relationship we want from Palestinian queers, or what is our role, right? That was not explored enough. And we didn't have enough probably insight or vocabulary to explain these like complex feelings, right? And this is not only, and this has been happening with different partnerships we have. And so I really relate to what Sumaya is saying. I don't see anti-pinkwashing as, yeah, there are some like events we could like join forces and tackle and like raise awareness and use also educational tools, and not only campaigning tools to open conversations. And that I would love to see to be done in a conversation and partnership with Palestinian queers and different local groups where it's relevant. But most important is to see how really pinkwashing and this like lens is related to my local context, right? And these are like these are your friends who are complicit with Zionism, not my friends, right? This is your colleagues, not my colleagues in a way. Of course, like I care about that, but it's just not. We already should have a baseline that we could have this conversation if it was integrated in our local context. I know we had like a lot of conversation internally saying we don't want to say big things, right? But I think like the smaller things that we could, the more concrete things we could get, I'm hoping to have in a conversation later on in different opportunities.
Thank you both for those answers. I think it's a really important and, as Sumaya said, challenging question of how to integrate, this kind of analysis. And one of the things that was helpful for me, a bit like thinking through it, was, thinking back on, doing events as like a student organizer, and, what could have been done differently, or like what kind of approach, I would take, if I was doing that same kind of organizing now. And I think that one of the important things is this sort of, the emphasis on de-emphasizing and de-exceptionalizing these sort of like single issue politics, and instead integrating, not only the queer feminist analysis, but various other sorts of bodies of knowledge into, how we put on events, how we do solidarity campaigns, et cetera. So if I'm doing an event on the Intifadas, like I'm not just going to talk about, the history and the sort of, the narrative that, is normally recounted in terms of like the political structure and what happened and like the forms of resistance. But I might also in that same event talk about the gendered, aspects of the Intifada, the role of women in the Intifada. And then also, since it was such a formative period for these, techniques around regulating and policing sexuality, that might also be integrated into the analysis I present. So in a way, it's not about, like Haneen said, just, doing joint events or doing events on this specific topic, or like bringing in Palestinian queers to speak, but actually making it, a part of the analysis wherever you go. And there's a question I think that's come up in a couple of different forms that I would really like to hear Haneen talk about, which is, we've been talking a lot in terms of the dynamics between local Palestinian organizing and sort of Western audiences, and because that's sort of the dynamic that was created with the early years of anti-pinkwashing activism. So Haneen, I wanted to ask you a bit more about, regional collaborations and like knowledge sharing that alQaws has been involved in. What sort of, translocal exchanges of knowledge or skills have, taken place in other colonial, post-colonial contexts, and the sort of, how alQaws views them, even though it operates as a very sort of rooted and local grassroots organization.
Not sure I get the question, but I will try. You mean about our like regional work?
Yes. Yeah. So working not specifically with sort of Western, you know, American, European audiences, but beyond that.
Yeah, there is like, let's start from the assumption that even the local context and the regional context is like clean from colonial or like neoliberal or imperialist kind of interest and dynamic and narratives, which is not, it's full. And I think these debates that we're having with international activists, and maybe that's like will make you guys feel like better. We were having, including a lot of these challenges and dynamic with a lot of Arab queers from different like countries, and with Palestinian queers and with Palestinians inside Palestine, right? So this is like not exceptional too, right? The misunderstanding of pinkwashing, the resistance of like adopting like kind of a radical approach to these issues. And so that's like for, it's really important for me to say that. So it's like these things are not divided according to geography, right? These are like politics that are like around us, and we could see it in, I don't know, talking with a friend, right? About queer realities. So that's like really important to say. Unfortunately, and I think that's something that's changing lately, a lot of this regional activism, also encouraged by a lot of international alliances and a lot of like funding, also left grassroots work and became professional NGOs, right? Or like, as I call them, factories of producing a lot of these like knowledge production or programs that are like agendas of foundation and not agendas of grassroots communities. And I think that also, and I think alQaws could have done more in like really finding partners in different, at least in Tunisia, because there's like, and this is something we started to do recently more strategically, have alliances on like the organizing itself, and from there like really cut the political questions. And we could have been like, we could have did that before, but also like, don't forget that alQaws is like working nationally. So we have like at least 4 hubs that we're working in. Like we have networks in every place in Palestine, and that demanded a lot of like resources. And these conversations are like tough to tackle. Like I think we had a big regional, we called queer dardashat, which is like chit chat, queer chit chat in a region. And we did a couple of these meetings, and the third one was should have been about like pinkwashing, and it's been we didn't do that, right? I think there is some kind of a deep difficulties about how to start this conversation. And maybe I can tell you guys from New York or like what to do. I'm not sure I can say what to do in that like sense, right? So it's about like, maybe the question should be about how our relation to our governments, right? What is our radical position to government that now, maybe I'll rephrase the question, the answer differently. Like we always say, it's maybe a privilege not to have a government inside our like context, right? So we were liberated from that like expectation to work with your government, right? In other like context around the region, that thing is not that clear, right? So if we were in Tunisia, for instance, I don't know what would our like approach would be. I would hope that would be radical as now, right? But this is, I mean, like our anti-colonial approach is not because we are smart. It's because we are in this like situation, and we evaluated our relationship with this entity. And I think this is something we could bring to a lot of like LGBT groups in the region, about like how we look into the problems and our like struggle, how we map our relationship with these different like entities, who's our oppressor, who's participating in our oppressor. And Yunus talked about the al-arz discussion, the tahina, right? So it's a food factory, a Palestinian food factory that gave money donation to an Israeli LGBT organization. And I don't want to go into details, probably the link is in the Q&A, But alQaws brought into the analysis the capitalist analysis, right? And people were like freaking out because now alQaws is also adding the capitalist like analysis, right? Not enough the social, not enough like the colonial one. And now we are like also critiquing the food factory and the economic interest and like exposing how it was not because they love the gays, right? And like we could see like how for us it's natural. This is like what we see when, because like our political like approach is really clear. So I think like also maybe we focused a lot on international queer activists, but these discussions didn't even like start that well in here or in the region, and there's a long way to go.
Thank you, Haneen. Sumaya, do you have any sort of concluding thoughts on that or any of the other points?
I'll let Haneen have the closing words.
Wonderful. Well, Haneen, if you have any sort of final thoughts that you would like to leave everyone with, since we're about at time.
No, just for alQaws, just really the beginning of the conversation. So also like the relationship with queer Palestinians, that's not something we solve in the document, and we are really excited to have these conversations, but now we have some kind of a base to have this conversation about, right? And I think we should all make effort to bring these conversations to different groups and not focus on the people who's familiar with pinkwashing. And this is why I'm excited that we organized this together. Sumaya and the Adalah was part of this conversation, and I'm looking forward for more in-depth conversation about Palestine, about the queer question, and I don't know, our big future for now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Haneen and Sumaya. This was an incredible event, and it was great to have you both in conversation and speaking on these questions. And thank you again to everyone who tuned in. If you'd like, please follow Adalah alQaws for across social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you all so much, and have a good rest of your day or evening.
Thank you, Nas.
Thanks, Nas.